The Chinese player Ding Liren has had a rocky start to this tournament. He started round 4 on 1 out of 3, but today he shows that he is a really dangerous player. He had white against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. Let's go from the beginning. So knight f3 from the Chinese player. c5, and it's an English and a fairly regular opening. Previously, e5 was played by Vachier-Lagrave against Ding Liren, but the Chinese player said he was well prepared for that. But he was also well prepared for this move, which Vachier-Lagrave has also played in the past. So this is a very standard position. And now the most popular continuation for white is to play castles. And then you could say the main line here is to take on d5 and then play bishop e3, and now black can play either queen d6 or bishop takes b2 is possible, and so on. There are very long lines here, and white usually gets back his pawn. But this position, this variation has some relevance to what comes later in the game. But instead of castling, the Chinese player played a very enterprising move, h4. Well, this appeals to me a lot. I love attacking with my h-pawn because actually when you do this, this can be very annoying for your opponent, but you risk very little because it doesn't really harm your own king position. So this is a provocative move. It was first played by the great Danish Grandmaster Bent Larsen in this exact position. Here, well, yeah, black struggles to find a good way to respond against this. Let's see what happens if h6. Well, this is very logical. So you can meet h5 with g5 and just block white out. But Ding Liren said afterwards that he wanted to just play very simply like this. Now, you'll notice there's exactly like the main line that we've just looked at, except the pawns on h6 and h4. And this is very clever from white's point of view because it really isn't possible to take here because black will lose this pawn on h6. And also, sometimes there's a possibility to play queen c1, and you'll notice a double attack there. So it's really a bit irritating for black to have this pawn on h6. What else? Well, you could drop the knight back to f6, but it's a bit passive. Or you could block with h5, but the problem is this gives white access to the g5 square at some moment, and it's going to be hard to get rid of that knight because f6 looks very unattractive. So Vachier-Lagrave played instead bishop g7, allowing this pawn to advance. And I think this already justifies white's opening choice. Of course, this can't be taken. That would taken here. That would split the pawns. Vachier-Lagrave played e6 to support the knight on d5, and Ding Liren just pushed on. And this pawn can be very annoying for black. As we'll see later on, it can create mating net, but also, even in endgame, it can be very annoying for black because that pawn on h7, if it ever falls, that white pawn is very close to the queening square. So this is a real positional trump. Knight e4 played, and the bishop comes back to e7. Now, the bishop has left the long diagonal, and this puts an idea into the Chinese player's mind. He considered playing d3 and thought this was quite playable for white, but instead, well, unsurprisingly, when this long diagonal is open, he wanted to try and exploit it, and he played this very enterprising move, b4. This is fantastic stuff. with a simple idea of bringing the bishop to the long diagonal, claiming this long diagonal. Actually, I thought that it was actually a mistake to capture with the pawn. I thought it would be better to play knight takes pawn on b4, and in that way you keep more control over the centre. So, but I mean, Liren thought that he had pretty decent compensation here, but with the idea d4. But you can play f5 and then try and exchange off this bishop. Well, indeed, you do exchange off the bishop, and well, black seems to be okay. I think that might be a stronger continuation in the game, but there are other ways for white to play that. The advantage of taking with the pawn is that if white ever tries to push with d4, then the knight can possibly leap into the c3 square. But still, white has potential with his central pawn majority. And now Vachier-Lagrave played bishop d7. Liren said after the game he felt this was too passive and that black should have struck out with f5. But of course, it's risky playing f5 because e6 is a bit weaker, and you open up your king position. So it's not easy to make a decision like that. But yes, probably this is a stronger move, and bishop f6 exchanges off this dangerous bishop. But even here, white can upset black's position with something like this, and this is extremely double-edged. I think white has pretty decent compensation in that position. But yeah, if I were black, I think I'd feel a lot happier knowing that, well, I've exchanged off this dangerous bishop. Let's go back. So bishop d7 and knight c5 before black has a chance to play b6, restricting the knight. The knight leaps into c5. Now, this can't be taken because the knight would be trapped. So castles from white. And now, again, I think a much safer move is to play bishop f6. Get rid of that dangerous bishop, give back a pawn, and, well, maybe white is a bit better here, but, black has chances. Indeed, black can play knight e4 here, and this is the problem that I mentioned earlier, that pawn on b4 does give support to the knight coming into c3. So black is well and truly in the game there. But Vachier-Lagrave played b6. So he's still a pawn up, but now he's lost the two bishops. And white has a very natural plan of advancing through the centre of the board. And here probably the only try is to play knight a5 and move the queen out to a4. And this is still very tricky. I mean, I don't know, it looks a bit funny to put the queen so offside, but it looks like the only chance that black has. Remember, this is a big plan, just to steam through the middle of the board. Instead, Vachier-Lagrave played knight g4, and this is definitely a mistake. He must have overlooked that bishop h3 was possible. And the point is that after knight takes pawn, Liren just played queen e3, and because of that bishop, it's simply not possible to defend that knight in any normal way, and the knight has no squares. So Vachier-Lagrave had to play g5. Now that is such an ugly move. This, of course, was taken, and black's king is now in desperate trouble, and this knight still stuck on the edge of the board. It's a horrible position. If bishop c5, then this can just be taken, and now knight f3, and the knight is a goner. f5 played. Well, it's the only move that keeps black in the game, but what an ugly move. I mean, this just weakens the pawn on e6. The king is terribly placed, and now it was very easy for white to win the game. That's a forcing continuation, and you can see that well, this pin is terrible. There are pins here. The rook is attacked. Black is utterly lost in this position. The French player tried bishop c5, hoping that this would give him a little bit of relief and a little bit of play, because suddenly he has a bit of security in the centre. But of course, it's not necessary to exchange off the rook. It's much better to play actively, and the Chinese player played rook c4, threatening a deadly check on g4, and then probably you can take the rook. h5 played, and now, because the rook is on c4, it covers the d4 square, so now there are 3 pieces protecting the pawn here, and that's all over. If bishop d6, well, now we can just cash in with knight takes f8. You can see these pins are just deadly. In the game, Vachier-Lagrave took on d4, but this is absolutely hopeless. You can see this just opens up this line. And, well, indeed, it just loses a piece, and after knight e5, White just started taking pieces. At the moment, White is a rook and a piece ahead, and, well, that was too much. Vachier-Lagrave resigned. I think we saw from that game how talented Ding Liren is and why he is the current Chinese champion. Remember, he's still only 20 years old, and I think, well, now we can see he's coming into his stride in the tournament. Maybe he's shaking off the jet lag. See you for round 5 tomorrow.